Hi, good morning. I'm Erika Mallin. I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Arts Program, and we are here in Shakespeare in a Divided America, so if that is the session you chose, you are in the right place. With me here today to have this discussion is, on the end here, Oskar Eustis, the Artistic Director of the Public Theater in New York City, also of the storied Shakespeare in the Park. The Public Theater, and Oskar, as you may know, has produced works from, seminal works from Hare to Hamilton. And we're very pleased to have Oskar selected last year as our 2020-21 Harman Eisner Artist in Residence that the Institute supports. And it was all virtual, so I'm very thrilled to have you here, Oskar, in person. I'm also thrilled to have James Shapiro here. Jim is a professor at Columbia University and also is the resident Shakespearean scholar at the Public Theater and has written numerous books, including your most recent, Shakespeare in a Divided America, what his plays tell us about the past and the future. So we wanted to talk about Shakespeare, and we wanted to pick a theme from the festival to dig into a little bit, just because Shakespeare is so prolific in our lives and in our schools, and has been adapted for modern times, has been made into musicals. It is probably one of the biggest, he's one of the biggest spin-off writers ever. So in talking with Jim and Oskar, we picked the theme of the festival, which is power, and we wanted to talk about, I don't know if this will be a big surprise, but Julius Caesar. This is a very relevant play always, and we're going to talk about, first of all, the sort of modern day production that was done at the Public, directed by Oskar, and then Jim is going to help us sort of look at the history of Shakespeare as part of the American DNA, and sort of how it becomes part of our psyche over the years since our birth as a nation. So in 2017, in June of 2017, Oskar directed a production of Julius Caesar at Shakespeare in the Park, and Trump was, Caesar, I'm just gonna slow down here. So Caesar was played as a lookalike Trump. As many of you know, and I don't think this is a spoiler, at the end, Caesar gets assassinated by a huge mob and is stabbed over and over again. And so this caused an incredible controversy, whereby protesters went onto the stage to interrupt the production. There were hecklers sort of strategically placed in the audience. There were videos that went viral. It also ended up on liberal media and conservative media, including one of the protesters going on to Hannity, for example, and saying this was just too shocking to see a portrayal of a sitting president being assassinated over and over again every night, 8 shows a week, and that this was just wrong. So all this is gurgling, all this is happening, and on opening night, Oskar gives one of the incredible speech about this play, and I urge you to watch it on YouTube. But Oskar, basically you talked about the clear and present danger that is embedded in Julius Caesar, that there are lessons in there for us, no matter what our political views are, no matter where we come from, and that it applies to all, and that we must heed the words of this play as humans and as citizens. So I wanted to, as a way into this, I want to talk to you about that production as the director in that time. And I also want to talk to you because you have this very elegant way of connecting theater, Shakespeare, and even art to the health and the necessity of having theater as it relates to being a democracy. So I'm going to throw that over to you, Oskar. And then, I'm sorry, before you start, Oskar, we're going to have Jim sort of then kind of take us back in time.
Thank you, Erika. The idea of doing this production of Julius Caesar, it was really simple. It was the day after Election Day, 2016. We'd been planning to do Richard II, but on that Wednesday I changed my mind. And the experience was that when the election returns came in on election night 2016, I was in our pub at the theater watching on screens with many of my staff, and the younger staff were sobbing and devastated, and I realized that we have to try and speak to this moment. And since power was the issue then, as it is the issue of the panel, Julius Caesar seemed to me the perfect vehicle. A couple of things immediately come to mind about that. One of the famous characteristics of Julius Caesar's play is it's actually hard to completely focus on who the protagonist is. And if you go from act to act, you can actually see the engine of the play change from Cassius to Caesar to Brutus to surprise Mark Antony. And the very form of the play is a struggle over whose play is this? Who's got the power to tell this story? And Shakespeare brilliantly actually works it into the play itself. The other very simple thing that occurred to me is that the Trump campaign brought back the mass political rally as a political of import in U.S. elections, which it had not been for many, many years. And so I thought, oh, this is a play that spins on two different orators trying to get the audience on their side. Brutus speaking to the mob and rationally, calmly, his reasons for the assassination, the mob seeming to agree with it, and then Mark Antony coming and stirring them up with emotion, stirring them up with thoughts of vengeance, stirring them up with anger, and finally stirring them up with greed. That Caesar's will has left every man in Rome 25 drachmas. And of course, he wins the crowd, who then destroy the city of Rome. Cassius and Brutus flee, and about 45 minutes later, they're both dead. And not only has their attempt to preserve the Republic failed, it has failed so completely that anything that we would recognize as democracy goes into hibernation for 2,000 years. So their failure is total. And it seemed to me that this would be a rich place for us to try to explore our current moment with Shakespeare. And what I was stupid about was that I thought this was going to be a controversial production of Shakespeare, and we could all get into talking about the play. And this is why I'm an old-fashioned guy, because I had failed to notice what had changed about the world. We didn't have a ferocious debate about the play. We had a ferocious debate about a 10-second clip of video that somebody had illegally taken and was shown on Hannity night after night during the first 2 weeks of the run. We weren't having a debate about the play. As a matter of fact, we had protesters and we had counter-protesters. One of the counter-protesters had a big sign that says, "Read the swear word play." Because, of course, what happens, Mr. Hannity would say on Fox, that New York liberals are cheering in Central Park while Donald Trump is stabbed to death on stage, which was absolutely objectively not true. The Trump analogy was played for comedy for part of the first half, but as soon as the assassination began, you could just feel this pall over the audience. This was not a heroic, noble thing. And as a matter of fact, what it leads to very clearly is the destruction of the very democracy that the conspirators thought they were trying to protect.
Oskar, let me read two things you told me. My role in this began about a month after Oskar decided to stage it. We just talked about the text, and I was just really curious, knowing that Oskar had done this play 3 times before, how he was going to do it this time. And I'm a Shakespeare scholar, and one of the things you discover looking over a 400-year period is every 20 years or so, there's a production of Shakespeare that doesn't respond to the times, but anticipates the times. So let me read 3 sentences from what Erika referred to earlier, from Oskar's opening night speech, before all these protests occurred. This play warns about what happens when you try to preserve democracy by non-democratic means. And spoiler alert, this is Oskar's words, it doesn't end up too good. But at the same time, and my book was severely reviewed recently for failing to see what Oskar saw, how the events at that production were a dress rehearsal for January 6th. This is what Oskar said that night. One of the dangers that is unleashed by that is the danger of a large crowd of people manipulated by their emotions, taken over by their leaders who urge them to do things that are not only against their interest, but destroy the very institutions that are there to serve and protect them. So how did you feel that 5 years before that happened?
But don't you think the really crazy question is, how did Shakespeare feel that 500 years before January 6th? It's just, it's so, he's an amazing author for many reasons, but one of them is that his plays seem to be able to take on the shape of any time they're performed in. And remember, that's the fundamental thing about theater. Live theater is always happening in a specific place at a specific time. It's never sort of generally anywhere. And somehow Shakespeare's plays are such that they can contain any place and any. He's a genius author. We can talk more about that. But one of the things that Jim is referring to is I had 50 extras planted in the audience every night. In a 2,000-seat theater, you can afford to put 50 of you people in there. And we give away the tickets for free anyway, so it's not like it's going to hurt the bottom line. So we had 50 people in the audience that did not reveal themselves as part of the cast until Mark Antony made his friends.
And they're not in togas. It's a modern dress production, and they're in modern dress.
Yes. And Mark Antony makes his friends Roman's countryman speech, and as it goes on, not only is the cast on stage responding, but the cast in the audience starts responding. And this was incredibly exciting and really theatrical until actual protesters started to disrupt the show, get up on stage and stop the show, which happened every show for the last week of the run.
And I was in the audience, and I knew who the 48 extras were, and it was quite terrifying for New Yorkers hardened to violence in the streets to first watch protesters rush the stage, get handcuffed and let out, and then faux protesters pop up everywhere. And people, it was one of the most extraordinary experiences because you couldn't tell real from fake protesters. It was the most extraordinary theatrical moment.
And it was so amazing I had to compromise it, because after the third day of protesters actually interrupting the stage, I had to give all the extras permission that if anybody around them was getting too frightened, they were able to say, "I'm in the show, don't worry," because it was actually too scary otherwise.
I never told you this, but I couldn't take it after about 6 nights of protest, and started getting up to leave, and the creatives sit in the back, and I had to walk down a long staircase, and I'm a 60-something white guy looking just like the kind of person who would rush on stage. And the security were making their way to me to hog-tie me. And luckily, a friend in security stopped them from wrestling me to the ground before I made it to the exit. But it was fraught. I want to read one more thing and ask Oskar to respond to it. Please, please.
Oskar, just say, because I want this audience to hear again about Julius Caesar and what it speaks to about democracy, because this is what this, it was so prescient, this show, but I think because of your speech and what you said in that, to try to bring it to the audience in a way that was not controversial or upsetting, that you tried to pave the way to make it accessible to all.
Let me read the passage that speaks to that and speaks to the Aspen issue of power, which is what we're here today to reflect and converse about. I recorded Oskar telling me this early on. It's not that I think Julius Caesar is right. It's not that I think Brutus is right. What I'm watching is a group of people struggling with how to take political power, and then how does that political power reflect their values? Anthony, you told me, is somebody who can take power but has no idea how to make that reflect his values. With Brutus and Cassius, you have the case of people who don't know how to take power. And with Caesar and Octavius, you have people who were able to take power and were able to use that to reflect their values, which is to have power. Power becomes an end in itself. Yeah. Maybe that's a way of responding to your question.
Yes, right. But I really want people to understand the notion, the belief, particularly that Oskar has, so eloquently talks about, which is theater, democracy, culture, art are inextricably bound together.
Thank you, Erika. It's absolutely true. It's something that Jim said to me earlier this morning. The thing about theater is it's always in dialogue. It's always conflict between different points of view. And I think it's why it's the fundamental art form for democracy and why theater as we know it was created in the same decade in the same city as democracy as we know it in Athens. Because what theater depends upon to work is the understanding that no one person holds the truth, that the truth is to be discovered in the conflict of different points of view. And that means you have to be willing to listen to the other side, and you have to be willing to speak to the other side and let a true dialectic take place. That's the democratic impulse. And this, of course, was what I got so wrong, because the people, and I have to say there were tens of thousands of complaints and major corporations withdrawing their money from the public. There's a lot of fallout from this. But they weren't talking about the production. They weren't talking about the play. We did not have a common basis of fact. Mm-hmm. Some of us were seeing the play, and then many more people were watching the 10-second video clip completely out of context on Fox News and being told a story about what it was. And to me, that's a sort of perfect emblem of the way we're not sharing the same facts anymore. We're not talking about the same thing. We've got a thing, and then we're talking about an interpretation of the thing. And what's so deadly to humans is not being able to be in that dialogue. And the speech that Erika has quoted, I just thought I was so cool, and I was doing such a great thing to opening night, go out and ask everybody to tape me on their cell phones and spread it, and I made a wonderful speech, and everybody who listens to NPR in New York thought I was swell. Nobody else heard a word of it. None of the Fox News listeners, none of
That didn't go viral.
What's that?
That didn't go viral.
No. But what I was, the stupid thing, what I should have done is the minute this started, I should have tried to insist that I go on Fox News and I talk with anybody, and I would have been made mincemeat of, right? I'm not suited for that environment. But at least then I would have been speaking to people and saying, this is not glorifying assassination. This is actually doing exactly what Aristotle said theater should do, which is it is purging us of those feelings. If we had fantasies that somehow there are non-democratic means of restoring our democracy, this production was intended to dispel those fantasies and say that we can't do it that way.
And there was a tradition and a history of only seeing one side of this play. Yeah. And for me, the representative figure in that was John Wilkes Booth, who only acted in Julius Caesar once in his life with his two brothers 5 months before he assassinated Lincoln. And he played Antony in that. But his vision of this play was not a conversation. For John Wilkes Booth, this was a play that justified assassination. And when he leaped onto the stage after shooting Lincoln fatally, he shouted out in Latin, "Thus to all tyrants." So Shakespeare can be misused. And when I say misused, I mean only spoken of or taught or staged from a single perspective rather than that conversation. And why Shakespeare is so important is he's just about the last thing in America that we all share. Political left and right, 90% of high school students still read him. So he matters in this respect.
Well, and I think what's also interesting about that example and also Oskar, that production, is that I think we don't realize just, he's quoted, that he has become very American Shakespeare, right? And, Shakespeare first started in a theater in the Round where people could heckle and people could throw things at the play. But it's, from your book and the productions that we see, it's always astonishing that I think often people don't realize, or maybe they do, but just how accessible he is, whether he's writing about a toxic family or he's writing about power. And I think if you could, Oskar or Jim, just finish the story of Julius Caesar, because it doesn't end well. They go from a Roman republic to, in history, to a Roman empire.
That's right.
And I think that's an important thing to just,
Acknowledge. It's absolutely true. And, I hope, at the risk of boring you with reviews of a 5-year-old production, it gives some sense of the way that Shakespeare is always our contemporary. Shakespeare can always be used in the moment to talk about the issues of the moment. And it's one of the reasons he's so important. The other reason he's so important is that he is our common heritage. Saul Bellow famously asked in a snide manner, who is the Shakespeare of the Zulus? To which one can answer, Shakespeare is the Shakespeare of the Zulus, because he belongs to everybody. He's a great cultural artifact that we all need to be able to participate in. And in this country, the other thing that we've tried to do is try to take Shakespeare to people who don't normally get to see Shakespeare and to help them discover how much it means to them. And we have 2 projects, the mobile unit, which tours to prisons and halfway houses and shelters to tour stripped-down productions of Shakespeare. And we have a big program called Public Works, where we actually work with community-based organizations over the year and then put on these large pageant Shakespeares in which we have 5 of the greatest professional actors in New York and 200 community members, some of whom are stepping on stage and saying Shakespeare after just being released from 20 years of incarceration. And that modeling of the democratic process, not only in what the play says, but in how you do the play, has turned out to be absolutely thrilling.
And for me, as an academic who's used to teaching smart 20-year-old Shakespeare, I was skeptical of what it meant to go into Rikers, which is a scary place, with 8 equity actors who are employed by the public theater who perform a 90-minute version of Shakespeare. And one of the things that I quickly discovered was the things that are essential to this play, to these plays, rather. Violence, families that are torn apart, dysfunctional, depression. All those issues are where these prisoners and inmates live. They are closer to Shakespeare than I am, and I've studied it my whole adult life and taught and written about it. Watching them respond to these productions. I remember a day at the Metropolitan Federal Prison. We were on the roof. The warden said, if you're attacked, just go to that side of the building right there, which was very reassuring and completely unnecessary, because it was so meaningful to these men on that hot summer day. And listening to Chuck Iwuji's Hamlet, young black actor, terrific Hamlet, they were just locked in. And I realized they're getting this play. They don't need an Ivy League professor to tell them what it means. They could explain to that Ivy League professor what this play means.
One of the things about being, all of us who do the prison work come out saying, why do we do anything else? Because it's so beautiful and powerful. But in men's prisons, watching almost universally, the audience comes in like this. And clearly one of the things that's happening is that showing emotion or showing connection feels dangerous. And watching them over the course of the play, and there's usually a moment when they begin to realize, oh, I'm understanding what's happening. And then there's a moment when, oh, I'm caring what's happening. And watching, and then also sort of feeling the pride that they feel because they do understand it, because it belongs to them, is a glorious thing. Women's prisons are much more responsive right from the beginning. And one small story, it's closed now, but on the west side there was a women's prison in New York, and we took our production of Measure for Measure, which was our first mobile unit there. And in Measure, a nun, Isabella, is going to the substitute duke to plead for her brother's life. Her brother is going to be executed for having slept with his fiancée before marriage. So it's a state that hopefully will never resemble ours. But this duke is strictly enforcing these laws, and she pleads for his life. And in pleading for his life, the Duke develops a mad, passionate lust for her. And he says, I will spare your brother's life if you yield up your virgin patent to me, if you'll sleep with me. And she is shocked and horrified, and of course says no. Dearer than a brother's life is my chastity, she says, which made her very unpopular in the men's prisons, I promise. But she refused to give in, and he said, well, you have a day to think about it, and then give me yours. He leaves the stage, and Isabel's left alone on stage. Nicole Watson, the brilliant black actress who played this in our production, then turns to the audience and says the next line in the play, which is a soliloquy, to whom should I complain? And at the women's prison, a voice immediately came, the police! And Nicole looked a little startled and then realized that Shakespeare had equipped her, because the next line is, if I did report this, who would believe me? And she said, right to that woman said, no one, girl. And it was, of course, I had my Shakespeare geek moment. Oh my God, call and response. That's what it must have been like at the Globe. Those people weren't quiet. Oh my God. But once I got over the Shakespeare geek, the human sense of, this is in many ways, Measure for Measure is a play about justice, and performing it in front of people with justice issues who understand how the difficulties and the tragedies and the arbitrariness of justice and power was just illuminating for the whole play. And it also just firmly convinced me, as Jim said, if you do it right, Shakespeare does belong to everybody. He's everybody's property.
Well, I think there's a, particularly we saw with 2017, the production where, the liberal elite was used over and over again, that description. And I do think, and I think we're not blind to this, that theater, art, is often considered not accessible to everyone. That it really should be like Shakespeare originally was, which is anybody can come in, and no matter what station you were. I think this is a time when access is being really questioned. And we have a few minutes before Q&A, but I want to get to two things. One, how do we tackle access? There's the mobile units, the going into the communities, but because with theater and art comes power as a human and as a citizen. And what's this next phase? And I guess embedded in this question for both of you is, what's the next Shakespearean play that is going to sort of, come out in your mind? If Shakespeare and you are the scouts for the future, what is the next play and how we access it?
Since Oskar gets to actually choose the next play, I'm going to let him answer that question, but I'm going to give a little historical frame in response to that. There was a time in American history between 1935 and 1939 that our government decided theater belonged to everybody and created the antecedent for the mobile unit that Oskar is describing. It's called the Federal Theater Project. And within 3.5 years, 1 out of every 5 Americans had seen theater for either free or for a nickel or a dime, next to nothing. And it was transforming the culture. And there were plays literally called Power. There were plays
and they paid the artists.
They paid the artists $20 a week, which was enough to keep them off the dole. And it was a great experiment that was crushed by the first House Un-American Committee in 1938, which saw it as low-hanging fruit and decided to attack New Deal policies by attacking its soft underbelly, theater. So there is a precedent and possibly a future, although probably not in my lifetime. Oskar.
If it's not in your lifetime, it's not in my lifetime, Jim. But one of the things that I did at one point as an experiment is, if you look at a map of the United States that marking red and blue counties, and you do it on a county-by-county level, what you can say is, okay, these are the counties that voted Republican, these are the counties that voted Democratic. But you could also say, oh, all of those blue counties are where the nonprofit arts institutions are, and all of those red counties are lacking such. And what it makes you realize is that we in the culture industry have done the same thing to half of America that the economy's done, that the educational system has done. We have turned our backs on them and said, you have nothing for us, we have nothing for you. We are, as culture workers, failing in our democratic responsibility to try and create a dialogue of everybody. Now, the Federal Theater Project was a massive, brilliant icon of how that was done. The government-funded theaters all across the country and communities all across the country. They did it as an employment program, which is also brilliant. And
Mind-boggling.
Yeah.
yeah, and has to be looked at differently. But boy, if I think there's one challenge, it is how do we actually make it true that the culture belongs to everybody, not the culture belongs to those people who are cultured enough to support us.
And that brought out the WPA and the federal, brought out just a wealth of new art and new, it was a golden age where across the country there was no blue and red for that. So I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a great model to think about and hopefully to push forward here. So I'm going to ask again before we go into Q&A. What's next? Because during 2017, there were many theaters who were doing Julius Caesar. They didn't do it quite like you did, Oskar. And by the way, Oskar also got visited for a few hours by the Secret Service to make sure that he wasn't plotting an assassination, just in case. But so, what do you think?
Inside trading, we have to let them know what the next...
Well, just one thing about the Secret Service, because it's why you should never trust your first impressions. I was called and ordered by the Secret Service to meet with them an hour later. They came to my office and they looked straight out of Men in Black, two guys with dark suits and skinny ties and white shirts, sat down totally somberly and asked me a series of questions for about 90 minutes. Did I own firearms? Had I ever incited violence? And went through this long list. And it was pretty intimidating, right? But it went okay, because I honestly don't have any desire to incite violence against anybody. We got to the end of it, and the agent who had been leading the inquiry said, all right, I would like to tell you that we were legally required to do this because we received thousands of complaints at our offices around the country about your production, about what you did. And so we have now fulfilled our legal obligation, and we are closing the case. And he literally shut the notebook, and then he said, and I love Shakespeare. It was just like, just don't judge by the cover.
Right, exactly.
I'm going to leap in and say measure for measure.
Why?
Because it's a play that's set in all the sites that are now contested. There's a prison, there's a court, there's a political site, there's the margins of town and country. There are those who are exiled from society, and there are even brothels that are being shut down. So it's a play that I think is a very American play right now.
And that substitute Duke that I was referring to enforces a strict moral code on the city, and that's why people get executed for fornication, even if it's
He's an unelected political figure.
That too. So that's a great choice. But the other thing, of course, to say is that, if we do our job right, every production we do will make people, my God, that's prescient. How did you know to do this? And one of my favorites that's coming up is we are reviving a production we did in the summer of 2017 called a production of As You Like It, which is a public works production, and we'll have 200 community members on stage. And when we first performed it in 2017, we performed on the night when the president had first issued his Muslim ban, and the one that was later overturned. And in the production, there is a moment in the Forest of Arden where all of the people have fled from the tyranny of the Duke and they are living a life of freedom. And the refrain of the song is, have no fear, all are welcome here. And the cast was singing this to the audience, and the audience was singing it back. And it was just one of those moments where nobody had to editorialize. You just had to say those lines, and everybody knew what we were talking about. And it was just gorgeous. And again, it's the kind of thing that happens with Shakespeare, and it's very hard to find other authors who that happens with. And maybe just to close up, why is it so hard to find other authors? Well, it's two things. One, he's the best writer who ever lived. And partly he's the best writer who ever lived because of talent that was innate and born in him, and partly because he was the first writer in 2,000 years who was being asked to write for a completely mixed audience, from illiterate groundlings to the Queen of England to the Cambridge, and he had to find a way to write that could speak to all of those people at once. It's the audience that made Shakespeare so great. That's right. And finally, the other thing that we have to acknowledge is, as Jonathan Bates said, if there hadn't been a storm in the English Channel in 1599, we would be performing Lope de Vega all over the world. That is actually impossible to separate the triumph of Shakespeare from the political triumph of the English-speaking peoples around the world. Now, one can judge that any way you want, but what nonetheless is true is that appreciating, enjoying, and feeling like you own Shakespeare is a key to having a seat at the table to arguing about what our culture is about. And so that's why passing off that ownership, not tribally restricting it from the Zulus, but giving it to everybody and saying this is our common heritage, this is our common culture, is a liberating act, I think.
Well, on that note, let's, before we go into Q&A, let's give a hand to Oskar and Jim. Yes, I will, someone's giving you a mic. We have this question here, right up front.
Kate's got the microphone back there.
Oh, sorry, Kate, please go first, since you have the microphone, and then.
Thank you. Thanks so much to all of you and Erika for organizing this conversation. Just, Oskar, you, during COVID, led a consortium that for the first time got our federal government to provide relief funding for the arts, which was a notable advance in appreciating the sector as a kind of bedrock institution and not just something that could be fobbed off as sort of parlous entertainment. Wondering if you can speak to the kind of argument that you felt was persuasive, and if you learned anything about making a certain kind of argument that could persuade the government. And then, Jim, I'm just wondering, we're in a moment when the humanities are in real trouble, and that's been the subject of a lot of conversation here. What kind of arguments do you think the humanities should be making to recapture some of the power that it's had in the past?
Take that.
Pretty easy answer to the second question addressed to me, and thank you, Kate. Grassroots. I think a top-down model of culture is going to be a failed model for all the reasons Oskar was describing. I think academics have to come to places like Aspen or thousands of smaller festivals and gatherings around the country. They have to write books that non-academics can and will read. I hated Shakespeare in school. I never took a Shakespeare course. So I feel the pain of people who are exposed to things that make them feel stupid. And academics have to stop doing that if they want to create a grassroots love of theater, of culture, of the arts. It's really simple, and it means spending time and figuring out how to connect with communities, especially because so many left liberal academics, because of the job market or limited job market, are scattered among all 50 states. So they're physically, geographically in a position to make a difference. Will they? I don't know, but can they? I hope so.
And politically, Kate, that it's very kind of you to mention that. Nataki Garrett from Oregon Shakespeare Festival, Maria Goyanis from Woolly Mammoth in D.C., and I formed a coalition in August of 2020 that now includes over 130 theaters with every state represented in it. And we engaged in a lobbying effort that we were one of the groups that successfully passed the Shuttered Venues Operating Grant, which was $16.1 billion to live performing institutions to save them during the COVID crisis. Theaters would have closed all over the country without this help. The federal help was absolutely indispensable. And I think three things made it possible, starting from the most quotidian. We decided early on that in this group, the only people who could participate were the leaders of the organization, the CEOs, the artistic directors and the executive directors. So we said from the start, this is not something we're sidelining. This is something we're making absolutely central to what we're doing. And that, of course, activated a ton of other resources. Second is that we were in a crisis that everybody could see. It wasn't just our crisis. It was a crisis of the country, so that the crisis in the theater field could be connected to something larger than itself. It wasn't seen in isolation as special pleading for the theater, but rather as we have a crisis everywhere, the theater's part of that, let's support that. And finally, it was the two arguments that seemed to sway the day were an employment argument, again, that we needed to keep employment in the sector from vanishing, and institutional importance to the lives of communities and cities. And it was astonishing. It was a bipartisan bill. It was introduced by John Cornyn of Texas and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Chuck Schumer, I have to give him credit, he worked like crazy on this. We had an hour-long meeting with Chuck scheduled on January 7th of 2020. And, you know, as soon as January 6th happened, we go, that's over. And he kept the meeting for a full hour and engaged with it. It was just like, don't you have something better to do? But it was that connection, I think, made for a lot of elected leaders, it made visible the impact of the performing arts on their communities, not just in, you know, for the artsy-fartsy, but for the economies, for the employment, for the mental health of the communities. And of course, it was a one-shot deal. But, you know, Kate, as I know you've been doing as long as I've known you, trying to connect up the ways that government can support the creative sector and the creative sector can support the culture and the community as a whole, that's our work right now. And in order to do that, we just have to keep trying everything to make the theater actually matter. Not just say we matter, but actually matter. And then I think the support will come.
Please.
It's not very often that I can sit in front of two Shakespearean scholars. And so therefore I've gotten up the nerve to ask this question. Who was Shakespeare? I've gone through my whole life reading about him and never knowing, and people saying what he could have never known. He was an uneducated Englishman. He could never have known about these exotic places. I even read maybe 5 years ago that his work was written by a sophisticated Sephardic Jewess. And so, guys, what is the truth as you know it?
You know, I'll take this one, Oscar.
He's literally written the book on this.
For about 30 years, I was asked this
You were
question,
investigating.
and I finally realized I had to take off 5 years from writing books that I'd much rather write. And I wrote a book called Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare? So I strongly urge, still in print and cheap paperback. But right after that book came out, I got a letter from the Supreme Court of the United States. And I tore it open. I thought initially it was jury duty. I did. That's how little I know about the Supreme Court. I did. And it was a letter from the late Justice Stevens. And our correspondence is now archived in the Folger Shakespeare Library. And he wrote to me saying, I think it's the Earl of Oxford. And if you notice, Shakespeare's signatures are all wobbly, suggesting he was illiterate. And being from Brooklyn and having tenure, I wrote back and said, I noticed that your secretary typed this letter and signed it. And I think it's extraordinary that you, like Shakespeare, are probably illiterate because you can either write or sign your name. And I thought that was the end of it, and he kept writing back, And before I ghosted him after our 8th exchange, I pointed out that the man he was supporting was promoted by an Englishman named Thomas Loney, spelled Looney, and it was a fundamentally anti-democratic argument. The arguments that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare are undemocratic. And I said, how can you believe this and serve as a justice whose opinions I value so greatly? And he said, I can. And at that point I said, then I can't continue this correspondence. It's always a political answer when that question is asked.
Okay, so that's the answer, and I think we're out of time. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.